I'm Blues, and I'd like to welcome you to my REH Hot Licks video. And what we're going to be doing today is covering a bunch of different things ranging from bending to vibrato to phrasing to equipment to everything else in between. So what we'll do is begin. I'm tuned to E flat, so you may want to start tuning up with me here, and we'll start with an A. Okay. There's a couple different things I'd like to cover. First thing I'd like to point out is I'm going to show you the ways that I do things and the ways that kind of works for me. But let's keep one thing in mind, which is I don't really believe there is a right or wrong way, just simply a way to get the desired result that you'd like. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you my way and my approach to the guitar and kind of how I learned and the right and wrong things that I do. And it's ultimately going to be up to you to kind of take this knowledge and make it into your own thing. Like I said, as long as you get the end result, that's all that really matters. The first thing I would like to cover, we're going to start slow and kind of build up, would be bending. I think bending is very important because what it does is it takes your vocabulary of notes and it ultimately really kind of helps it grow a lot. By taking the same notes and bending them, you're kind of getting a lot more with what you're doing. And now we can start with the simplest stuff, which I believe are like the 2-fret bend, which is the standard stuff that most blues players do. For example, let's say we're playing in D, which would be I believe most players kind of do a 2-fret bend, which is kind of like, ultimately what you're doing is taking a note and bending it up 2 frets. And what I'm doing is working with a very simple, basic, kind of like a pentatonic type scale, which is the first scale that I learned. And so I'll kind of work with that one a little bit. For example, let me show you what we're working with so that you understand where we're going. Probably. Now, I primarily kind of tend to stay with the higher strings just because they're the easier to bend. So, for example, the most common bends that are done, at least you hear in a lot of the bluesy type stuff, is, work with more of the higher strings. For example, like... or kind of... And it's very basic, but what it does is it gives you a very strong foundation to work with. And from there, you can go to the next step, which would ultimately be working with different types of bends to help your vocabulary grow. For example, the most common one, like we stated, would be a 2-fret one, which would be... What I like to work with a little bit differently is taking a 1-fret bend, and it's still basically the same notes, it's just a little different. For example, the note I would come in with would be more of a... So by taking and doing 1/2-fret bends, you're going to ultimately work with the same basic notes, just get a lot more out of it. And by doing that, what it allows you to do is ultimately expand your vocabulary without really changing any notes, kind of like cheating, kind of cool. Another thing I like to work with, which you can also keep in mind, is also working with kind of like not necessarily a full fret or a 2-fret or a 1-fret, kind of working with like a 1/2 fret, which is ultimately something that guys like Beck did, and a lot of players like that. And ultimately, you're taking a note. Let's say this note here would be. You can take it and get more than just You can kind of get everything in between, like a. And by doing that, you can ultimately make your sound a little bit different. For example, I try working a lot with, 1/2 fret and also things in between that are technically not necessarily correct, but kind of work and give your playing a different sound. And you can also overbend. A lot of players do it, and done properly, it can also add a lot to your playing style. For example, kind of like... by taking that note and overbending, once again, it's not necessarily any different notes you're working with, just a different application of bending. Now, I think bending's very important because ultimately what it allows you to do is just, make a standard scale sound a little bit different, which also brings me to the next step, which is kind of like your vibrato. I think the vibrato is very important because it really helps separate a lot of guitar players. I mean, you have to keep in mind that, a guitar is basically, some frets and 6 or 7 strings, depending on which one you have, and a couple pickups, and you have to realize that all your favorite players sound totally different. And it's not because they have anything special or do anything differently. It's simply a matter of fact that, they take what they do and do it differently. So I think it's kind of up to you to kind of focus on how you're doing what you're doing rather than trying to figure out what everybody else is. For example, I think the vibrato is very important because the same note, vibrato 2 different ways with 2 different sounds, it's like 2 totally different feels. For example, I can take this note here and make it almost like a ballady type feel. Like I can take the same note, use the bridge pickup, and make it more of a rock thing, like and so ultimately there's really nothing. The note's not different, it's just how you did it. For example, a lot of the blues players have been doing this lick, you can take that lick, give it a different sound, different vibrato. It's like the lick didn't change any. It's basically just the way I played it. So keep in mind, it's all at your fingertips. It's simply a matter of you as a player deciding, what comes the most natural and getting your own sound out of it. Also, in regards to vibrato, there's a couple different ways to achieve, getting the vibrato that, you're going to choose to be the one you're going to work with. But also, the whole reason for even working with vibrato and kind of trying to focus in on it is a lot of it kind of started when I first began to play. The very first, in the very beginning stages of my practicing, I wasn't really sure of pitch. I had no idea of where to bend the note, and I always used to kind of like overbend, but never intentionally. If I was playing an E, I would kind of come in and kind of bend a little sharp. And it was not quite the desired effect I was looking for. So what I used to do is that by working with the vibrato, I figured if the note was kind of somewhere in the middle, and I bent between here and there, I knew it was in there somewhere. And that's ultimately how I originally kind of came up with that really wide. And that's ultimately how I developed it, by working with kind of covering myself. So that's how I developed a wide vibrato, and that's why I use, for my playing style. And some exercises to work with depends on, how you want to achieve your vibrato. A lot of players do it differently. A lot of players pull down on the string, for example. A lot of players push up. You're ultimately, as long as you're using just your fingers, you're ultimately just taking the note and bending it sharp. You can do the sideways vibrato, which a lot of the classical players do tend to favor just because of the nylon string, don't tend to give as much as the steel strings. But ultimately, that's going to be up to you and how you decide to get the best effect you're looking for. What I do is I typically tend to want to use my fingers, and as far as exercises, what I kind of did is that it was just a matter of building up the strength in my hand. So what I would do is take a guitar and string it with heavier strings. For example, these are 10s, 10 through 38, and I would use, on the practice guitar I had for working my finger strength up, I would put like 11 through like a 56. Sounded great, but it was just miserable to play because I was used to playing, the guitar set up for different types of music. So ultimately what I would do is I would try and play and work. I would just sometimes sit at home with like the TV turned off and just sitting there working on the strings. And what it ultimately did is it's kind of like lifting weights with your fingers a little bit. And also when you went back on a lighter string guitar, you could fly all over the guitar, which kind of was pretty cool. And so these are things I think you can kind of work with in order to help, hone your vibrato chops up. And like I said, I use my fingers, and a lot of my sound comes from my right hand versus my my left hand versus my right hand, just due to the fact that I tend to get a lot of my sound, all my sound pretty much seems to come much more from my left hand, just because it's kind of the way I've developed my style. I tend to not rely on as much of my picking hand as possible. And like I said, I use my fingers, so you're ultimately always pulling the notes sharp. You may want to consider using your whammy bar if you do have one. Like I said, typically on most guitars you tend to go flat with the whammy bar, for example, and it gives it a different effect. For example, if I take this note here with my fingers, I tend to pull it sharp. If I used a whammy bar set up on most guitars, you tend to go flat. So I tend not to use my whammy bar because it's kind of, I've just developed working with my fingers, and it's also I can't get as much of a response out of it, especially on the higher strings. And if I tend to use the bar, it kind of gives it a different feel altogether. So I tend to kind of favor the hands for sure. You can pull sharp with the whammy bar if you choose to. For example, a lot of effects are, to give it a different effect. I tend probably not to favor that as much, with the exception of pulling up on harmonics like The next thing I'd like to touch base on is something that's probably the most important and also kind of the hardest to teach, just due to the fact that it's something that becomes a very personal thing, which is ultimately your phrasing. And the licks you're playing are ultimately only as good as they're kind of set up to be. For example, if you're playing on a fast song, everybody expects you to play fast. Try playing slow, because it's something that's a little bit unexpected, and it tends to give kind of the listener, something to latch onto per se, rather than trying to, beat the masses. So a lot of the phrasing, like I said, is going to have to do with your rhythm and the way you phrase stuff. I learned a lot from watching drummers play. From watching drummers, I realized they only had a certain amount of things to hit, yet they could play extended periods of time without repeating themselves. So I like to kind of, work with setting up the lick. For example, like I said, playing on a faster song, people are going to expect you to play fast. So try playing slow. Also, try letting the phrase breathe. For example, a lot of players are so content on just trying to shove everything into there, and a lot of times what you end up doing is kind of shooting yourself in the foot, ultimately, because you're trying to outdo yourself. And if you give people too much of a good thing, ultimately what they do is kind of just lump it all together, and it's expected of you. So what you can do to kind of save yourself a little bit of trouble is when you're playing, try purposely kicking back and try letting the note do the work per se, or letting the phrase do the work. If I'm playing in E, and everybody expects me to be, if I'm playing over, let's say, a standard progression, kind of like I think a lot of people are going to expect me to come in and go, save yourself a time. If you're playing over this progression, okay, and I think what you should also try doing a lot of times, and I kind of do this a lot, almost by using my fingers, is that when you're working on your phrasing, try incorporating a little bit of rhythm into it. As far as the phrasing goes, if you take your, kind of give your lead playing a little bit of rhythm work, ultimately what you can do is give the listener kind of something to latch onto. So it's definitely something to try and incorporate into your lead playing, rather than going out and trying to kill the person. Let the notes breathe. There's nothing wrong with an extended vibrato, And for example, a good way of doing this is a lot of times I'll try and shuffle stuff, and it kind of helps give a fairly decent feel to what I'm doing, rather than just kind of cranking out standard licks. By throwing kind of a shuffly feel into it, if you're playing over a shuffle, it really helps. It's kind of like okay, and ultimately, to sum up phrasing as best I can, I hate to tell you this, but ultimately the only way you're really going to get your own sound is you kind of have to put in the time and practice up and get your own thing. It's something that you kind of have to figure out on your own, because it's such an individual thing. I mean, players, for example, like Richie Blackmore, I really liked his phrasing. I thought it was a very unique way of phrasing, and no matter how hard I tried to copy it, I just never could, because it was always his own unique thing. And so the reality is it's something you really have to develop on your own and put the most time in. But it's something to definitely be conscientious of, because it really helps define your sound as an individual player.